Good morning or afternoon, depending on which meeting you are attending. I was not able to join the coordinators' meetings today, so I am leaving a brief video. And the topic that I know there's going to be some discussion during the meeting would be use of accommodations with the ISASP testing. And so we're going to just take a few minutes to kind of review the basics of that process, and I know there'll be some time for some discussion with those involved in the meeting. What I've got in front of you on the screen here is just a brief summary of this process and the model that ISASP is using, that Pearson is using for accommodations and accessibility. And this was on a blog that was sent out back in December, but just kind of wanted to start here and then take you to the Accessibility and Accommodations Manual and dig a little bit deeper there. But what you're seeing on the screen here right now is a nice summary of how they have set up this process for ISASP. So they've put together a three-tier approach, and with the intention of maximizing accessibility for all students in appropriate ways, so that we hopefully get the most fair and appropriate test results from all of our students. And so you can see the first tier is universal, and these are features that are available to all students. There are no specific requirements in terms of a disability or other situation that would be required here. All students have access to these what are universal features. And you can see a couple of the examples here. We'll glance at the manual shortly here. And the manual is linked into the agenda to make sure that you have access to that. But things like amplification, answer eliminator, even the embedded calculators that are really just part of the test now. Electronic highlighting, so some of these tools that students could use to maximize their accessibility are available in here. So these are essentially just built into the online electronic version or universally available to students for the few out there that might be doing paper pencil as well. So that's the first level. Then we move up to the next tier, designated features. And so these are also available potentially to all students. However, they must be indicated in the system in advance. So in other words, these specific accessibility features have to be noted in the ISASP file ahead of time to essentially turn them on for students that may need those kinds of things. Now, these are often features that are appropriate for students with disabilities, whether they have an IEP or a 504 plan, but they are available to potentially to all students. So, in other words, there may be some students without IEPs or 504 plans, or maybe without EL plans as well, that may need designated features. And you can see the description there. Use of these should align with classroom supports that are provided. So there's a few examples of the things that are there, available there: answer masking, a bilingual dictionary, native language translation, some color contrast features, and even text-to-speech options, and we can talk a little bit more about that. So those are designated, ultimately meaning you have to turn them on and make it available for a student before they would be able to use them in the system. And could be for students with IEPs or 504s, but could also be for other students. For example, maybe a student that is getting intensive classroom interventions, could potentially access some of these features if the school team deemed that appropriate. Now, the third tier, we're actually using the word that we're a little bit more familiar with, accommodations. So in this third tier, these are changes in procedures, alterations to the materials, and with this idea that we're used to of for students that have disabilities or other conditions, giving them a fair and equitable access to the assessment, and doing that, presenting the assessment in a way that aligns as closely as possible with how that student is accessing content in the classroom. So accommodations, these are also in the things that would need to be indicated in the system ahead of time, turning them on per se for students that need them. And the access features that we call accommodations, this tier 3, those are to be guided by an IEP, a 504 plan, or an English learner plan. So when these features are being used, they are to be students that have one of these plans documented, and presumably the need for a particular accommodation documented in their IEP. And so a few examples there: speech to text for written answers, use of a scribe, sign language interpretation, use of Braille, Spanish translations. Those are some of the things that Pearson, that ISASP is calling an accommodation, and should only be used if supported by information in the student's IEP 504 plan or English learner plan. Now I've jumped us right to a view of the manual itself. This accessibility and accommodations manual is linked in our agenda for today. To make sure that you have access to that, this manual has been available for some time in the Pearson site. Some of you, or maybe some of your test coordinators, have been kind of following closely the Pearson site as ISASP has evolved, and this manual is on there, listing the accommodations and accessibility features that are available to students. Now, as we page through the manual, I jumped here to a page a little bit past the cover here, and this graphic is a nice graphic that really just summarizes what I mentioned here, and you'll note that this kind of takes on a flavor of a MTSS kind of a system that's making sure that we address the needs of all students. And so you can see in the circle format here the same things that we just talked about. Universal features available to all kids, designated features for students that may need those, potentially IEP or 504 plan, but maybe others that have access issues in the classroom. And then that smaller inner circles would be typically those accommodations, using the word accommodations, that we would expect to see listed in the IEP, the 504 plan, or an English learner plan as well. So as we start to page through, then the manual, which I think is really useful. It gives a pretty clear description of these features and even gives us some visuals. And so you can see here, starting with Table 1, these pages show the universal features, things like amplification, answer eliminator, and so on. We certainly won't go through all these, but notice the format. It's giving you little icons saying either online or paper or both. You know, how are these available? I know that most districts are doing online, but there's also the issue of paper pencil for the cases where you're using that. It gives you a little visual in most cases, some details of what that feature may be, and then it says embedded or not embedded. Embedded meaning that it would be built right into the test versus having to do something outside of the test to use that feature. And so you can see there's just a listing of all these different accessibility features. And so these universal ones kind of ultimately are just part of the test. They're built in there. Any student can use them. You don't need to turn them on. So calculator use, for example. The appropriate calculators will be available to students right within the test when appropriate. Equation editor when appropriate, those things. Reference sheets, even highlighting. So just some really nice advanced features that may be useful to lots of students as they're taking the test. Then we'd move on to the designated features. These would be features that may be for a student with something indicated in their plan, such as an IEP or 504, or other students that may have that need that aligns with their classroom support. But again, designated features must be activated for particular students. And so a whole variety of those that are available. There were a couple that I just wanted to maybe take a minute to point out, partly because I know there have been some questions out in the field. You can see here, human read aloud. Okay, so for students taking the test online or the paper pencil, there can be a trained and qualified human reader that could read parts of the assessment to the student. You'll notice as an appendix in the back of the manual, there are kind of guidelines, to make sure that human readers, are handling things appropriately, things aligned with test confidentiality and those kinds of issues. But notice that human read aloud it's showing to be available here for the English language arts grades 6 through 11 in mathematics and science. So notice for math and science portions of the test, there's no grade restrictions. So for students where it's appropriate, so even think of past practices where having portions of the test read to a student to allow for a more accurate testing of areas like math and science, that is still available. And even in a way kind of expanded when you look even for English language arts, for the upper grades, for grades 6 through 11, that is possible, if appropriate, to have a human reader. So in the past, there would have been this concept of, well, we don't read the reading test to the student because that would change the construct of the test. But you can see the position here is kind of saying that, you know, could be appropriate at the secondary level, at grade 6 and up, but not indicated or not allowed for younger students, lower elementary. And you can think of the rationale there, I believe, as being, well, that would be a time where, you know, part of what we're testing would be foundational reading skills. So if we read that to students, we'd be changing the construct of the test. But for upper grade levels in the English language arts, that is permitted, which is a little bit of a different conception from what we've been used to in the past. And again, only when the need is there, never the intention to give an advantage to a student. And so then I've paged down a little bit further here, and kind of parallel with the human read aloud, there's text-to-speech. So there is a built-in feature and for text-to-speech where students could essentially press a button, and again designated, so that would only be available if so designated for particular students. And similar to human read aloud, available for math and science when appropriate, and then available for those upper grade levels, but not for those elementary primary grades, only available on ELA for grades 6 through 11. So there is this embedded text-to-speech feature if turned on as a designated feature for students. So finally, we get to the third tier, which the term being used is accommodations. And a reminder, these would also be items that would need to be turned on in the system for students. And these would only be when we have a documented need in an IEP, a 504 plan, or an English learner plan. And we can scan here. These are all in the manual. Just examples of these accommodations that could be available, either turned on or for the non-embedded, you know, made available to students when so designated. Even things like sign language interpretation. And one here I would note that will be new and different would be a scribe. We know that ISS, but we are writing is being tested really for the first time ever in statewide assessments for Iowa students. So there's the issue of, you know, in some cases, if, for example, in an IEP, if a student had a significant writing disability and would have scribe kinds of services, you know, dictated and written as part of their schoolwork, this could be an option for students on the state testing as well. So you can see the explanation over here. Students who have documented a significant motor or language processing difficulties. Other examples, maybe even someone who had a recent injury that would make it difficult to respond. But if documented in a plan, a scribe could be used. And there's also, as with the human read aloud, there's an appendix in the back of the manual that kind of talks about appropriate training and qualifications for someone who may work as a scribe for a student in the state testing. And with the scribe, you can see the description here. The student dictates her or his responses to an experienced educator who records verbatim what the student dictates. So again, that recording verbatim is pretty critical, not helping the student with their writing process, but more of the accommodation to help with that presumably motor difficulty of getting things written down, typed in the online version, those kinds of things. And so the question came up regarding, or this has come up out in the field, what tool might you use as a scribe? Well, a human scribe would be just recording verbatim what the student is saying, but if we scroll down further, there's one more related potential combination, speech to text. So what if a student would have that type of assistance? Again, this would presumably be a student with a motor impairment that would make it difficult for them to do the writing portion. So there could be an assistive technology device that would allow that student to use their device in perhaps a speech-to-text format to get their writing down. And so that is allowable if noted in their IEP and activated, put into place for that student. Notice how it's not embedded, meaning there is not that speech-to-text feature built into ISASS, but there could be a student using an outside tool to record their writing, and then that writing could be put into the system for them. We had at least one question in the field about what tool would you use. There would need to be some caution exercised because we wouldn't want that tool to give the student an unfair advantage. And just one, I know one question that came up in one district, what about something like Google Read and Write? Well, if some of you are familiar with Google Read and Write, not only does that, it's a very robust tool, not only does it have speech to text, but that tool has predictive word technology. It has all kinds of tools that help a student produce better writing, and those that tool is really good and very appropriate in instruction and practice for students, but it would probably be a tool that wouldn't be permissible in the state testing because it would go beyond just speech to text. It would give additional tools that would allow that student to perhaps have an unfair advantage on writing, at least in a standardized testing kind of a situation. So that is just an overview of what we have currently in the Accessibility and Accommodations Manual for ISASP. I know many of you have probably already experienced the testing, and maybe this is new for all of us, and have worked through some of these options for students that have disabilities or other needs. Some of you are still yet to do that, and I think the intention is to maybe have some discussion amongst the group at your meetings to see maybe what issues have come up with others, and just maybe to share your experiences with each other as we all navigate through this together. Thanks for listening.